let's be honest. I'll learn Hebrew someday. It's still someday. Yalla, let's start now. The University of San Francisco's Hebrew SF Summer Ulpan program is a live, immersive Hebrew intensive. Just 3 weeks, 3 hours a day. You'll learn to read, write, and speak using conversation, music, film, guest speakers, and culture in a supportive, high-energy learning community. All levels are welcome, even if you're starting from scratch. Learn more at usfca.edu/HebrewSF.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 531, Jewish Ancestors, Young and Old. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today, we've got Eli Raymer here to speak with us about intergenerationality, Jewish storytelling, past and future lives, and what it means to connect Jewishly across age, space, and time. Before we dive into that conversation, we have a few Judaism Unbouncements that we'd love to share with you.
That we do. I'm thrilled to bring the Unbouncements. First and foremost, we have mini courses in the Anyeshiva that are open for your registration. We've been plugging the first block between Passover and Shavuot of 3-week mini courses. Those have now started, so it's time to plug the second block. We have 2 amazing mini courses beginning in a few weeks. One of them is with our very own Rena Yehuda Newman. That's called Holy Chutzpah. You'll hear more about what that means in this episode towards the end. And second, we have a class with Aaron Wander on the early Hasidic rabbi Nachman of Bretzlev. So head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more about either of those courses. Financial aid, as always, is available for either of them. Also, a quick every once in a while announcement that we have our Judaism Unbound Discord. It's a bump in space where you can interact with other Judaism Unbound listeners, with Anyeshiva students, with some of our teachers, some of our staff, all sorts of cool folks. Just head to discord.judaismunbound.com to join. There's amazing conversations going on there every day now across many different threads. Some of it's deep dives into Jewish history and Jewish ritual. Others are just like, here's some fun pictures of cats, of Jewish art somebody made, whatever calls to you. So discord.judaismunbound.com. And now in terms of today's conversation, we thought a lot about how we should kick off sort of the interview stage of Rena Yehuda's co-hosting. We had 3 conversations that were just the 2 of us, and then we wanted to pivot back into talking to guests. Now that you know Rena Yehuda a little better, we thought about who might be the right fit, and we landed on Sophia Freudenstein, who we spoke with last week, and Eli Raymer, who we're speaking to this week. It's not on the same topic as last week. We spoke about halakha, Jewish law in Helsinki, and about, in general, smaller kinds of Jewish communities, global Jewish communities last week. But this week, we're switching gears. We're talking about storytelling. We're talking about eldering with an incredible person, Eli Raymer, who has been on the podcast before, but who has much more wisdom to provide our listeners. So with that, I'll throw things back to you, Rena Yehuda. Let us know a little bit about our guest today.
Thanks, Lex. Eli Raymer, formerly Andrew, who started going by the name Eli when he turned 70, is a Maggid, a Jewish storyteller in San Francisco who's lived on both coasts telling tales, doing somatic healing work, and writing books across his life. Eli has been on the show before, talking about his book Fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud, and he's here with us today, just having published Tales of an Urban Mystic, a spiraling memoir. Eli and I actually met through the certificate program. I was looking for guest speakers and specifically wanted a Jewish storyteller. And Lex suggested that I reach out to Eli Raymer, thinking that there would be some good conversational chemistry that we'd get on. And next thing we knew, we have been friends and chavrutas. Eli has been a tremendous mentor of mine now for well over a year. It's really a delight to have someone who I have so much respect and love for, somebody who has taught me so many things and told me so many stories, here to get to tell all of you, our listeners, some stories today. Eli, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. It's so good to be with both of you. It's been a very long time. Great to see you.
100%. I am excited to dive in to this conversation that is happening, like many of our conversations, across generations. That's always been important to Judaism Unbound, and we've been speaking about it recently as we've underwent this transition from Dan Liebenson as co-host to Rena Yehuda as co-host, with me as co-host throughout both of those. And I really want to start with you to hear from you. Why does intergenerational community, why does relationship across age matter in Jewish life and beyond? Like, we live in a world that doesn't have a lot of that right now. We live in a very sectored off universe where people in their 20s are really cloistered with other people in their 20s. People, like, we could go through every age, and it mostly is the case that we hang out with folks around our same age or our families that are transgenerational. Why might we want to bring that beyond just our family context to the broader world?
I think in a very specifically Jewish way, how many genealogies are there in the Torah and in the Tanakh? Again and again, we read, this person is the parent of that person, is the parent of that person, is the parent of that person. It's part of our culture to be in lineages. And I think what you said is so heartbreaking to me, is the way that is shattering. A few years ago, I was interviewed by someone who was giving his dissertation on queer elders. And we sat, this is the height of COVID, we're sitting outside. He asked me questions for 2 hours. And one of them was the only thing practically that he commented on when he asked a question. And he said, do you have friends of other generations? And I said, yes. I said, most of my older friends have died, but I have friends my age, I have friends in their 20s. And I will be, this wasn't the case then, but I'll be 75 in about 2 weeks. And when I said, I have friends of every generation, he stopped me and he said, you're the 40th person I've interviewed, and almost no one has said that. Everyone else says my friends are only my age.
It's heartbreaking to me to hear that out of 40 different interviews, you were the first. But I think my question for you, hearing that anecdote, is in your lifetime, have our communal relationships to intergenerationality changed?
I think in some ways very much, and in other ways, no. About 8 or 9 years ago, I went to a queer Jewish interfaith dinner and presentation. And I was sitting at a table with about a dozen people, with a friend who is about 25, 30 years younger than I am. And on the other side of her was a gay couple in their late 20s, maybe early 30s. All the rest of the people at the table were identified as cis women. And the 2 young men talked to everybody at the table. But if I asked them a question, they answered me in 1 word only, or 2, and looked away. And when we were leaving, my friend said, that was really weird. She said, but I'm thinking, is this still true? That often, she said, what I've heard, she's a rabbi, in the gay world, younger gay men think of older gay men as predators. And they're looking at you as a dirty old man. And I said, oh yeah, I'm used to that. And I remember when I was their age, having that kind of experience. So I think it reflects in different ways in different places, but I see it a lot. And I don't know what it's like for the 2 of you. How do you see intergenerational dialogue?
I love that question. I will say, I know you're in the Bay Area, and my uncles lived in the Castro, and they were around your age, a little younger, but not by a ton. And I definitely had the experience of mentioning to folks around my age, like, oh, I'm staying with my uncles in the Castro. It was clear that their associations of that neighborhood, which is predominantly gay men and often in their 60s or 70s, not all, it was clear to me that they were sort of holding back from saying some of those things that you were just implying, that there was this intergenerational discourse of, oh, that's where the old gay men live, and we don't really want to hang out with them. I kind of want to weave this into the fact that you tell stories really well in written form and out loud, that you're a writer, that you're a Maggid telling stories, because like if somebody were to ask me, like, what's the solution, right? Like, nobody did, but I would offer that I think we tend to bridge generations best through stories. When we share a story can be cross-generational. I mean, that's what the Bible is, right? Like, part of what's powerful about being part of the Torah portion cycle is that I'm reading it, people a generation before me read it, and like, a lot of people have related to the same thing. It's like we're all accessing a shared point on the graph. And that point on the graph is the story of Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and then Seth, and then the begats you mentioned, all the generation, and that we could go through the list of all those. And I kind of fool myself, and I think many of us fool ourselves into thinking, and in a good way, that the characters in the story are like our contemporaries. Like, when I'm reading a good story, whether it's biblical or a story written this year and it's fiction. I feel like they're real. That's the power of storytelling across generations. And I'm wondering if you share that instinct, that that's part of the way towards improving this. If I were being interviewed about eldering or youthing or whatever it might be, or middle-aging, which is more increasingly by the day the accurate description of what I am in the world, I also have those relationships. And the reason is that I'm part of Jewish life. And look, it's not that we read the Torah portion together in most cases, but it is that we share story. And so I'm kind of curious how we might weave storytelling, which is classically understood, the children on the carpet being told a story by the elder or the teacher. Like, there is a way in which that is how we do intergenerational dynamics sometimes.
I think it's part of the survival of humanity. The World Health Organization has estimated that by the year 2050, there will be 1.2 billion climate refugees. How will we survive? And I think one of the tragic gifts of the Jewish world is that we have survival tools. We have lived in horrific ways for centuries and centuries, and I think we need to pass that on. And I think it's an invitation to younger people to start to reach out. So recently I was sitting with friends who have a 4-year-old son, unbidden by me at age 4. He was starting to tell me about his past lives. I did not bring that up. And it inspired a story that I wrote where I am out, the character in the story, which I guess is me, is a grandpa out walking with his little granddaughter. And he has his phone out to take pictures. And she says to him, "You can't do that, Grandpa. You need to be present. Put the phone away. Notice everything that's going on." And in the story, at the end, what he comments on is, she's been talking like this since she could talk. And now that she's 7, I recognize the wisdom in her. And the story ends with the little girl, Eva, saying to Grampy, "I want you to remember that on a soul level, I am older than you." And I see that with younger friends who are 26 or 27. It's like, ooh, I'm going to be 75. I was ordained a Maggid 13 years ago, so I'm still in my bar mitzvah year. And I have,
Mazel tov.
Todah haba, and I have friends who are much younger than me. And I know in the teachings that we seldom talk about Gilgul, reincarnation, that lots of my students are much older than me. I recognize that. But there's a legacy that I feel is imperative for us to pass on. So I'm not into sports at all, but I feel like I'm passing on a torch from my teachers who utterly changed my life.
I think this is a good opportunity for me to bring up, Eli, how much I love your book, Tales of an Urban Mystic, your new book. I read it in like one fell swoop, just like full inhale, like a bowl of spaghetti.
Full inhale like a bowl of spaghetti. I'm obsessed with that.
Bowl of spaghetti when you're so hungry, just slurp it right in.
Yeah.
That was my experience with this book. And one of the things that is so potent about this book is I've never gotten to read stories about someone who intimately experiences, Eli, as you said, Gilgul, Jewish concepts of reincarnation with such intimate attention to the way that age is actually a very, very dynamic experience in all of our lives, right? Our bodies are a certain age, but the ages that we experience ourselves to be at any given moment is something that changes. And that there may, in fact, be a spiritual dimension to that has to do with many lifetimes back that we're also experiencing, often in the background, sometimes very much in the foreground. And as the experiences that you detail in this book, sometimes in ways that are completely all-consuming. And all of these lives collapse in on themselves, and we experience ourselves at many different ages and many different places. Hearing your quite tragic story about sitting with this younger gay couple who refused to speak more than a couple words to you. My experience in gay men's community too also reflects this, the way that what seems like an AIDS era homophobia, and then that dates back to sort of a 60s and 50s public homophobic campaigns to try to paint gay men as pedophiles, it's actually a fracturing in the lineage. When we think about the Holocaust and we think about the way that that damaged our ability to have intergenerational relationships, it's because there is this massive hole that meant that all of these stories and all of these lineages and all of these experiences and all of these people who would have been our friends and lovers and loved ones were vanished. And it ends up meaning that it is harder and harder to know your origins. And this is true of the Holocaust. This is true of the AIDS crisis. One of the things that I have loved so much in our relationship, and an intergenerational relationship for me as a Maggid in training and for you as a Bar Mitzvah Maggid, that we have, across 50 some years, is that we get to really talk about what it is to know our lineages, not just in a Jewish context and not just in a queer context, but in a context that's about the ways in which we are part of many lineages. What does it mean to inherit more than one lineage? And to think about what is the role of story in transforming that from an intergenerational standpoint and connecting us back to the people who we are in this body in this time now.
So I had a great aunt who I was very close to. And as she was slowly descending into dementia, as other people have this experience, she told me the same stories over and over and over again. And her kids couldn't deal with it. Her grandkids stopped spending time with her. But I adored her. One day I'm sitting there. She's in bed. She can hardly see. She can no longer walk. And a little light flashed in my brain. And I thought, oh, this seems to be dementia and negative. But it's actually evolutionarily purposeful. That before the invention of writing, any kind of recordings, when very few people lived to be elders, how did the elders pass on the culture to the younger elders in training? By telling the same story over and over and over again. And wow. I just realized I was being gifted. And so I can now tell you stories about how to survive a pogrom, what it's like to take the boat over the Atlantic and arrive at Ellis Island. And so now people in the family turn to me, could you tell me that story again that Auntie Manya told us about? Blah, blah, blah. So I think holding that as a wrapper, how does culture get passed on? How will culture get passed on when 1.2 billion of us in 25 years are living in refugee camps where there's no access, probably, to electricity, to phones, to recordings, to books? We're gonna have to tell stories.
I'm really moved by this, and I want our listeners to really be able to think, like, when am I a youth and when am I an elder and when am I both and when am I neither? I want to reflect a little on my experience in rabbinical school, in Aleph, the ordination program. And it started in the application process with some interviews and multiple people in the interviews. It was very interesting. They said to me kind of sheepishly, and these were people much older than me. And at the time I was in my mid-20s. Lex, just so you know, most of the people in our program are much older than you. And we don't want to hide that. We don't want you to be surprised. It is the reality of our program. Just wanted to let you know. It happened enough times that eventually I was just like, I am excited about that. I'm ready to learn from people different from me in a lot of respects. I'm excited to be part of a school which is geographically dispersed, where people live in different places, where people have different jobs in the world, where people are different ages, where people are all sorts of different identities. But I entered the program and I was a youth for the first while, and I got to own that. At the same time, I was in my mid-20s, same Lex, and I was in community with folks currently in college, and I was very much an elder. Some of my Jewish activist spaces, once I hit my mid-late 20s, like, most of the people were college students, and I was the institutional memory. I was the remember that time when? And I realized, because I had one day where I was like in an Aleph space where I was one of the youngest and receiving eldering from others. And then like almost immediately afterwards, I was in a different space. I had a moment of like, oh, wow, I'm like two different Lexes. Not in a contradictory way, but in some spaces, I am the young one being saged. And in other spaces, I am saging. And the word saging, by the way, that's a term that Reb Zalman, the founder of Jewish Renewal, uses to talk about this process of, I don't know, wisdom giving, usually from an elder to a youth, but sometimes in the other way, as you've said. And so I wanted to bring some color to that because the last thing I'll say is then 4 years or so passed in Aleph and I was about to finish. I was like 29 or 30, and there were people in the room that were 65, but they were just starting the program. And I was eldering them. They were asking me like, oh, Lex, you're about to get your ordination. Like, what was it like at this stage in the program? And I think there are ways that happens for a lot of us. And we could go to being at summer camp and the eldering process from being 8 years old to being like the wise old man as a 20-year-old in a context where that's the oldest. And like, I guess I'm curious, can you help us think more? Because I'm struck by what you said, that there's sort of the soul age and then the body age.
My brain is dancing in so many different places, but one I think is really, we're here because of the younger elder that you were all those years ago. Mazal tov and todah rabah for what you've created. So you've owned that. So often when I'm looking into sharing things with younger people who may not be open to the Jewish concept of reincarnation of Gilgul, what I like to say to people is there are clues in cultures where people believe in reincarnation and the wisdom we've brought with us, that carries through your life. But in cultures where they don't, those memories start to fade around age 3 in most of us. If this isn't making sense to you, there are clues in your life that you can start to look at. So you grew up in a really deeply engaged, observant Ashkenazi family somewhere. You have been utterly in love with Japanese flute music. That's a clue. When you're looking around your living room, why are all the paintings on the wall by Rembrandt? Copies that you've been buying for decades. So everybody has the clues, but we're not taught to see them as clues. But when we start to, it opens a doorway to deep wisdom. So I think this is the first step, if that makes sense, Lex, is to start to look at your own life.
I think there's something here to also be said about, for those listeners out there for whom reincarnation is not a part of their religious practice, it's not a thing that they think about, it's important to address the part of it that is still about story. I find myself often, in terms of my own spiritual outlook, I feel like I live in two places at once about it. That there's a part of me that feels that Gilgul is actually a really important part of my understanding of who I am and what my relationship to Judaism is and what my relationship to transkite, being queer is in my life. And then there's another part of me that I want to hold it perhaps more logically, right? Using some of the post-enlightenment frameworks that maybe I've inherited in this lifetime. And I think about this from the standpoint of what is a true story? The story of the boy who cried wolf. Did it actually happen? Do we tell it as quote unquote historical fact? No. Is it a true story? Yes. And it gets into, I think, a really meaningful question about what is truth and what is the way that story is ultimately about truth, even if it's not about fact. We know who we are because of stories. We know who we are because of stories that other people have told us, right? That's why intergenerationality is so important, because those stories help us situate us in the context that we find ourselves. I need older Jews to tell me what it means to be a Jew right now and what it's meant in recent lifetime, in recent memory. I studied history in school because I needed to figure out what happened before I got here. And I think about this too, as I've grown up and had my queer adolescence, right? And often they talk about how as a trans person, you go through puberty twice. I think there are 3 puberties. 1, when you may more naturally or biologically have puberty. 2, if you decide to medically or socially transition. And then 3, I think when your sexuality catches up to your gender. There's more than 1 puberty, to be sure.
And 4th, the puberty I wouldn't set foot in.
God forbid I go to that one. Right. When I was having those experiences, as I was coming of age at a time that is different, because queer time is different, I needed to meet elders. And for me, I have relationships, Lex, similarly to you, and Eli, similarly to you, I have relationships with people of many different ages. And I would meet these people in gay bars. I would meet these people at, queer justice events, et cetera, et cetera. And the stories that they told me about what their lives had been like, about friends who they had lost, about lovers who they had had, about what their current relationships and friendships and families looked like. Those were stories that helped situate me in time, coming from the fact that I came from a family that could not help me understand where I was in that origin. My Jewish family has helped me understand what it is to be a Jew in 5786, but it is my queer intergenerational relationships that have allowed me to understand what it is to be a young transsexual in 2026. And what does it mean to develop the capacity to receive story? We're talking a lot about how important it is to tell stories, but we're also existing in cultural contexts that make it very difficult for us to hear them or for us to hold them. I'm so moved, Eli, by your description of dementia as being perhaps actually a survival technique to bear down on certain stories so that they don't get lost. I lost my grandmother to dementia, and I remember those last stories that she would tell. And it's relevant because I often feel like in my peers, there's such a rigidity to using the wrong language or feeling misunderstood by people who are older than us, that there's almost a full-scale rejection of, oh, there couldn't possibly be anything of value here. But the ability to receive story from other people is just, that's also a survival mechanism. And so I'm curious about, on your end, what does it mean to tell stories as somebody who is an elder in this body? And I'm curious, on my end, what does it mean to receive stories as someone who's a whole lot newer here?
Well, I'll tease you a little bit, but when you listen to this recording again, please take out a piece of paper and a pen and make notes about what you just said, because that's the outline to your next book.
I've already got my Post-it note.
Perfect. I think in the Jewish context, there are two pieces that I was taught way back in college that are relevant to what we've lost. So one of my professors said to us, speaking to the students, and he was our parents' age, in your parents' generation in this country, wanting to assimilate into American culture, white Protestant American culture, meant leaving behind things that were labeled as superstition. So things like a belief in reincarnation, that's nonsense. Leave that behind. So there were many other practices, he told us, that were left behind. And the other piece he said was that 80% of the Jewish mystical teachers in the world died in the Holocaust. So what our legacy would have been, he said, we lost in two ways, because all those teachers died. And then our parents rejected that part of our culture because they wanted to be normal and American. And so how do we reclaim these things? And again, how do we look at our lives and the clues? Oh, the Rembrandt painting and the music from Brazil fills me with light. All of those things, we have to start owning them.
I find myself drawn to a thought that I want to test out. I don't know how confident I am of it. But we're talking about history. Rini Yehuda talking about how I wanted to know what happened before me. That's why I majored in history. My hypothesis that I want to test, that I don't feel super confident about, but which feels anecdotally true to me, is often people that are interested in looking deep into the past, deep into centuries, millennia in the past, are simultaneously interested in looking deeply into the future, centuries, millennia into the future. You're somebody who, when we first spoke to you on this show, we were talking about your book, Fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud, which is a future past kind of book. It's a book that takes place in a future where a document from the past is found, but it's the distant future. They find a document, this Brooklyn Talmud, from the more recent future, from our perspective. And so as you're reading, you're simultaneously looking at the future as if it's the past and looking at the past as if it's the future. It's mystical on one level, but it's also practical. Like I really, to go back to my hypothesis, like there is a way in which interest in the deep past, interest in those generations of the Bible may interrelate with speculative fiction, with books like Fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud. And given that that's a universe, a multiverse you dwell in, I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on the value as storytellers, as elders, as youths, of holding the future. You're somebody who has told short stories about potential futures or alternate worlds where aging is good and we want to do plastic surgery to look older. How might descriptively there be a relationship between one who holds the ancient past religiously, Jewishly, and one who's interested in the future? And what might we do with that relationship?
I went off to college to become an archaeologist because I was deeply in love with the past. That's not where I ended up, but I'm still in love with the past. And I think that the work of survival on this planet is both to own the wisdom that we've brought and to be present as we look at the future. So I think every story that someone tells about the future is a gift. And maybe none of them will turn out to be true. But hearing and seeing and feeling someone's vision is essential. So in my dystopian retelling that you referenced in Fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud, I imagine that 60, 70, 80 years from now, in a horrific way, peace has come to the Middle East because climate change is so intense that no one can live there anymore. Everyone has left. And I'm imagining people sitting in cities that you can live in who wouldn't have talked when they lived there, sitting there and saying, oh, I miss this, oh, I miss that. But this is a story that in my telling it, I'm telling it because I don't want it to happen. And so what I imagine 60, 70, 80 years from now is that the center of world Jewry has become Brooklyn, New York, where I've lived the longest in my life. My parents grew up. So for me, Brooklyn is the promised land often. And a lesbian rabbi invites the surviving rabbis, cantors, scholars from the Jewish world, all over the world, to come to create a new Talmud that never gets finished, as you mentioned, Lex. And then 60, 70, 80 years later, they find the fragments. So I'm looking backwards, I'm looking forwards, and I'm inviting everyone to do that, whatever your age is. To imagine, if you're listening to this and you're 25, what will it be like when you're about to turn 75? What do you want to see? And how do we get there? How do we get there in the face of what's happening now, in the face of war, in the face of pollution? How do we radically change our lives? And for me, the biggest teaching that I share is two things. I invite the people I work with and my students to be as present in their bodies as they can be. Honor that dance of sacredness. And when you're out in the world, don't listen to podcasts, even to this one. Look at every tree, look at every bird, look at every cloud. Feel that in your sacred, this is what I call it, in your sacred chosen body. Feel what it's like to be utterly present. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's where I go in response to your question.
Rini Yehuda is going to ask the next one, but I just want to say that that is my favorite non-endorsement of our podcast and all podcasts I've ever heard. That is my top tier. Don't listen to podcasts. I will lobby for listening to podcasts on another day, but I'm very convinced by what you said on this day.
Listen to podcasts all the time at home when you're sitting down, but when you're out in the world, be present.
This piece of advice really actually illustrates a huge point that we're making on this podcast, which is we're in an era where there's new technology every day, but really it's escalated. Even in my very short lifetime, I was born around the time of dial-up, right? And there are people for whom that makes me very young. There are people who may be listening to this podcast for whom that means that I'm very old, right? The rapid succession of technology.
And they're saying, what's dial-up? They don't even know what age that makes you.
Right. That like so many of the markers of age and generation, I think especially for people in their 20s and 30s, is actually about the succession of technology. And it means that the world, the texture of the world is changing so quickly that we don't necessarily know how to adapt to it. But some of us have also never been alive at a time where there was another alternative. And when I think about What does it mean for me to try to be utterly present? For me, I observe Shabbat in order to try to understand what that is like, but to be able to hear from somebody who lived at a time that this technology was not here, who lived at a time where you could not just have two little voices of Lex and Rena Yehuda in your headphones while you're walking along on the street. Eli, I need you so badly. You're talking about how telling stories allows us to conceptualize of other worlds. I love the past because the past proves that another world is possible, because many, many, many other worlds existed before this one.
I don't know who invented the word or the expression podcast. I don't know what they intended, but I'm thinking of a seed pod. And I'm thinking of casting it out into the ground so that it will grow again and watering it. How do we do that? You're planting seeds. And how do we step out into the world? There was a year in the fires up north were so bad, and you may have seen pictures of this if you don't live on the West Coast, where for 3 days the sky was black. And the sun, if you could see it at all, was a dark crimson smudge. And the air quality index was so horrifying that you really shouldn't go out. I don't want this to ever happen again. So we really have to ask ourselves, in the sense of our Jewishness, how do we bring back not just Shabbat, as you talked about, Rena Yehuda, how do we bring back the sabbatical year? How do we bring back those traditions that invite us? You need to buy this, you need to do that. Stop. But that's some of the dance that I'm inviting listeners to look at, whatever your age, much younger than me or older. What are the survival tools that you carry that we need to cultivate and share?
I really appreciate hearing you on so many of these different threads. I do find myself the child visiting a beloved elder in their life and pining. Tell me a story. I'm curious if you can bring one. It's putting you on the spot, but asking you to channel those Maggid muscles. Like, I believe and trust that for any moment, for any conversation, there is at least one and usually multiple stories to be told that will channel the right meaning into that moment. And I'm curious, given your rich well of stories that you've told and created and fostered yourself, that you've received, is there a particular story that you could bring to our listeners? I would love to receive that selfishly because you're a great storyteller.
Well, thank you. One of the best stories in my life, which I think I left out of my memoir, is about 25 years ago, when I moved to San Francisco. I was living 2 blocks from my synagogue, Shor Zahav. I wasn't working. And I spent a lot of time helping out the support crew. I'd help wash dishes. I put stickers in all of the books in the library. And about a year later, I gave my first sermon, my first drash. And one of the people on the maintenance staff came up to me after the service and said, I didn't know who you are, but I want to tell you a story. About 3 years ago, I was living in an SRO, single room occupancy, in the Tenderloin, which is one of the poorest sections in San Francisco. He said, I'm living in this SRO. My family stopped talking to me when I came out. I lost my job. I knew I had to live on the street. I packed up my backpack with a change of clothing, comb, brush, toothbrush, toothpaste. And then he points at me and he said, and your book, 2 flutes playing. And that's what I took to live on the street. So I stood in the hallway. I raised my hands to the sky, sort of symbolically gestured to God. And I said, it can't get better than this. Take me now. And that was about 25 years ago. I did a lot of interesting things, so I'm glad I wasn't taken. And it would have been devastating to the young man if I just plotzed at that moment, dropped dead. But a good number of years later, so there's a story, and then I'm going to wrap around the story. A good number of years later, a cousin I was very close to was dying and felt like her life was a waste. And I made up on the spot a story that I told her that I later turned into a story in one of my books. she's from the communist socialist part of my family and became eventually a born-again Christian. I remember talking to her mom once. She was the youngest of four daughters, and the mom said that she ran into her friend and said, "This must be so hard for you that your three older daughters belong to synagogues, and your youngest daughter belongs to a church." And the friend was Jewish. My cousin's Jewish. My cousin says, I feel like I failed all of my kids, that they belong to synagogues or a church. I didn't pass on to them, there is no God, religion is ridiculous. So my cousin becomes a born-again Christian, and she's about to die. And I make up a story on the spot, inspired by the story that I told you. And I wanted to amuse her. I wasn't sure I did. So I start out the story, which is later in one of my books, where I say, the night before the Messiah was about to reveal herself. And I wait, thinking, has my Jewish Christian cousin been offended? And then she cracks up laughing. So I tell the story to my cousin, and I'm telling this to everybody here. So the Messiah says to her mother the night before she's about to reveal herself, "Mommy, how did you know how to raise me? I was not an easy kid." And the Messiah's mother says, "Before you were born, I wanted to send out plain old-fashioned, like print paper, birth announcements. And there was only one print shop left in all of Raleigh, which is where my cousin lived, North Carolina. And I went there, and there was this young woman behind the counter who was so present with me, which is how my cousin was. So present that whenever you were driving me crazy and I wanted to throw you out a window or lock you in the closet or drown you in the bathtub, I would stop and I would remember that young woman. And that's how I knew how to raise you." And so why I'm telling this story is that we don't know what our impact is on someone already. So I know the two of you, Rini, Yehuda, and Lex, well enough to know, and I've heard from other people, the way that you've changed their lives. But what we don't know is, if the friend years ago hadn't told me about living on the street with my book, I wouldn't know that. And so to everyone who's here now, maybe already you've done that. And 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, the person who is the president of the United Planet Earth will be telling a story when they're being interviewed and say, 30 years ago, I was talking to someone who said something to me, who gave me something, who did something, who's one of your listeners right now, that changes their life. And we don't know that. We don't know what our legacy is, but we have to keep showing up.
The biggest piece of this that speaks to an unbound universe is a concept that Lex and I have talked about before, that Jericho Vincent has spoken about on their podcast, Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, which is part of our Unbound family of podcasts, which is this idea of holy chutzpah. There is a chutzpah, there is a brashness or a boldness that all of us have inside of ourselves that allows us to claim the tradition to be our own without asking for permission, without kind of going off and being like, "Oh, is it okay that I said this?" or over explaining how it is that you've decided that this is the way forward. What you're describing, Eli, is the fabric that allows holy chutzpah to happen. And it's actually these interactions that we have with different people, hearing a story from you, that one of our listeners suddenly says, "Oh, I just realized that this feels true to me." And it gives them the self-esteem to be able to claim that as a legitimate experience. I mean, James Baldwin has this incredible quote about how you feel lonely in the world and then you read. And suddenly through the act of reading, you remember, or I'm not alone in this experience. Other people have had it. And it's actually the experience of feeling less alone that enables us to have the holy chutzpah, to make those proclamations and to tell stories. One of the notes that I'm landing on here, what I'm speaking to our listenership is, what is a story that you tell again and again and again? And why do you come back to that one? Maybe there's someone who needs to hear that story. Eli, I'd like to turn it back to you to ask, how would you encourage listeners to tune into themselves to figure out what that story is that might actually be crucial for one person or maybe many people's survival?
My first thought is, again, to invite people to be present in their bodies and to imagine, and this might sound or seem a little creepy, but you're on your deathbed 5, 10, 50, 100 years from now. What do you want to share with the people who are gathered around you? And the second part of my answer, and now I'm teasing both of you a little bit, is consider reaching out to all of the people who were on this journey with you and saying, we're going to start an anthology of stories. We're calling it Holy Chutzpah. Please think about what's the essential story of your life that you want to share with others, and send it to us between 200 and 500 words.
I love that invitation. One of the stories that's been coming back to me is a Talmudic story about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who is at age 17 or 18 thrust into being the head of the Sanhedrin. He's the head of the great assembly of rabbis. And everyone is saying, what gives? Why is this child in front of everybody? And somebody says, you don't even have white hair. How can you be at the front of the rabbinic assembly? And his hair and his beard go completely white. And it makes me think about this conversation about how many different ages we are and the ways in which we are all called to these different moments of leadership. And he's still 18, but he's got white hair because he's experienced things in this life that somebody who maybe didn't get that white hair until, 60, 70 years down the line simply hadn't. And so when you're thinking about what is it to submit a story that requires Holy Chutzpah, it's also about what does it mean to acknowledge the many ages and experiences that we've had and take seriously the obligations and powers that we might have from those experiences. Eli, thank you so much for coming to speak with us on the podcast today. Such a joy to speak with you.
Thank you. It's such a gift to be with both of you again. And thank you all who are listening. Thank you for what you're doing to make this a better world.
We so appreciate hearing that. Thank you so much to Eli Raymer for joining us. And thanks, of course, to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, there are some amazing mini courses in the Onion Yeshiva that you can sign up for. The first block of mini courses between Passover and Shavuot has already begun, but there are 2 more courses that are coming up in a few weeks that you can sign up for, and we super hope you will. One of them is called Holy Chutzpah and takes the thread that Rini Yehuda talked about today into an entire class. So don't miss Holy Chutzpah with Rini Yehuda Newman. You can sign up at judaismunbound.com/classes. And there's another amazing class that you can take with Aaron Wander. He's teaching a class called Rebbe Nachman, Justice Beyond Despair. That's all about Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, an early Hasidic rabbi. So we hope that you'll check those out. Again, judaismunbound.com/classes, and financial aid is available. Now, as we close, we do hope that you'll be in touch with us, especially with your Holy Chutzpah summaries that Eli Raymer called for towards the end of this episode. So first off, our email addresses, lex@judaismunbound.com and Rini Yehuda @judaismunbound.com. That's RENAYEHUDA. We'd love to hear from you on that front, or any other questions, ideas, visions, comments that you've got. There's also our Facebook and Instagram handles. You can be in touch at @JudaismUnbound for either of those. And don't miss our website, where you can find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other resources for Shabbat, holidays, a wide variety of Jewish learning and unlearning experiences. That's judaismunbound.com. A last shout out before we close. We're so appreciative whenever you're able to support us financially, and you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift. It makes a huge difference to our work and allows us to continue it. So we would love for you to head there. We thank you so much for listening. With that, this has been Judaism Unbound.